The rhetorical triangle is part of how we conceptualize the use of rhetoric in argumentation. So what is rhetoric? Rhetoric is simply the art of persuasion. We look to the classical Greeks in the 5th century BCE as the group that first really wrote down some rules about rhetoric, and most of what we do in college when it comes to rhetoric is based in the classical Greek model that's been added to over the millennia, actually. For the rhetorical triangle, we primarily are looking at Aristotle in his book on rhetoric. And Aristotle said that when you are trying to convince someone to believe you, to do something, whatever, to change their minds, you must appeal to something in them that will motivate them. And he argued that there are 15 of these pistes, or appeals, but really you only need to know 3 because there are 3 that are so powerful and so universal that they will work most of the time. So you don't have to worry about the others. And those 3 are logos, pathos, and ethos. Now, as we talk about argumentation, if you're taking speech, or you have taken speech, or when you take speech, you're going to notice that there's a lot of overlap between what we do in composition and what you learn to do in speech class. And that's because rhetoric began as oral rhetoric. And then as more and more people became literate and learned to write, then the rules were applied to writing. And they really became 2 aspects of the same kind of discipline. And it wasn't until the Middle Ages, where they had a big argument about was oral or written rhetoric more important, that the 2 fields kind of split into 2 different disciplines. But again, there's so much that if you've taken speech, you can apply to this class, and so much that when you take speech, if you've taken this class, you'll apply there. So realize that you may know some of this, or some of it may be familiar, but there are some distinctions between what we do with written rhetoric and oral rhetoric. So notice you will have to adapt a bit. So anyway, let's think about the appeals. So the first appeal is, well, let me go back here and talk to you about this diagram. We call it the triangle because the best kind of rhetoric has a balance of all 3 of the appeals here. And so you see it's an equilateral triangle that shows that you need all 3 here to really make the best kind of argument. I will, though, tell you that in academic writing, there is a preference for logos over the other 2 for whatever reason. So again, just realize that as you're writing papers, I want you to use a nice balance of all 3, but realize that you really have to make sure you have plenty of logos in order to make the other 2 work. But really they're all intertwined if you do it right. So logos is the appeal, and you'll see here in my handout that I say text/logos. The use of logos is mostly kind of what you're doing in the text itself. That's very explicit. And by that I mean, what can you actually see by looking at the words and what kind of data you've given. So logos is basically reason. It's objective evidence, such as facts, data, statistics, that you are bringing to your argument to prove that it has merit, right? And so again, this is what academics primarily want to see. But logos, and we'll talk about this when we get to the propaganda video, logos can be vulnerable to being misused. People can take information out of context, so how they're using it is actually very different than what the original creator of that information was using it as. Reason can be faulty. People can make mistakes. They can make assumptions or all sorts of things that can cause problems with the logic of what they're saying. Data can be out of date, and so, well, that might have been true 50 years ago, but it's not true today, and we need updated information. So again, all of these things can be twisted and misused or misapplied, and so you always have to, again, be conscious of that. So I've given you a bulleted list of some things that you can look at here. I do want to say that for academic writing in composition courses at least, and I would say that in quite a few of your other college courses, when we're thinking about academic sources, we are not thinking about encyclopedias, Wikipedias, or wikis of any kind. We're not thinking about dictionaries or, lists of quotes, sites that list quotes. There's nothing wrong with many of those sources. It's just that they have a very base informational level kind of info, and they're not really research. They're part of research, but when you're choosing what to put in your paper, you want to use things that are much more specific, generated by people that are experts in the field or something like that. So when you have a paper in this class, you will have a certain amount of resources that you're required to use. If you choose to use a dictionary or encyclopedia on top of that, that can be okay, but it has to be a bonus source, if you will. Another thing to think about, again, is the use of primary and secondary sources. A primary source is a work that you would interpret. A secondary source would be something written about that primary source. And so if we were writing an essay that asked you to look at Hamlet, Hamlet would be your primary source, but to do research, you'd have to choose secondary sources, right? So again, that's just some technical terms there. When we get to another stage of videos about argumentation, we'll look at what are some of the hallmarks of good research and good credible sources, and what are some things that you should not use and cannot use in this class. You can go ahead and look at those sections if you want in the Master Guide to Academic Essay and Rhetoric, but we will cover those in a video. So the next of the three appeals is ethos, and this is most closely related to the writer. This is what the writer does or brings to the table that might make his or her argument more credible, more appealing to a reader. And so ethos is about credibility and trust. It's not about ethics necessarily, because ethics are just code of conduct. There's nothing inherently moral about someone's code of conduct. In fact, someone can have a set of rules they live their lives by that's quite corrupt and even evil. So sometimes we hear ethics and we think morality, but ethics is just, like I said, code of conduct. When we think about ethos here, we're primarily thinking about what is the writer doing to build trust and credibility. And part of that, you can see in the list, is what tone are you taking in the essay. So if you're writing about something that's quite serious, you don't do so with a flippant or amused tone. I mean, have you ever watched a news report and the reporter is telling us really horrible things, but they kind of have a half smile on their face? I always think about, why are they smiling when they're telling me that 5 children died in a fire? That's not funny, right? And so I think that, they're thinking, obviously, oh, I must look pleasant, but they don't realize that there's a contradiction in their tone and what they're saying. So again, tone can build credibility. It really does, I think, indicate the respect that the writer has for the reader and for the material. And if there's any conflict there, then the reader may say, well, I can't trust that person. They don't even realize that, this is a serious thing. It's not something to laugh at, Presentation is also part of ethos. The grammar mechanics, the style. Are you using the formatting that's required? So like in this class, you must use MLA. If you don't, then teachers, if teacher says you must use MLA and you give them something in APA, then they start to doubt your credibility. Because that's one of the hallmarks of someone either recycling a paper, so they wrote it for some other class and they're just turning it in for this class. It also can be, a sign that someone has cheated. That they found a paper on the internet, or somebody else had a paper, they bought a paper, and it was in another style. So again, that can harm your credibility. And if you're actually submitting this for a professional journal or something, if you don't use the conventions of the field, like for humanities or literature, it's MLA. If you turn in something that's not an MLA and that's what's required, then again, your credibility is going to be in doubt. Right. The quality of your sources and the type of evidence you use can also be part of credibility. By types of evidence, I mean, if you're trying to prove something and you're making a logical argument, but all you give me are emotional stories from eyewitnesses or people involved, then that's not a credible argument. There is a conflict in what you say you're doing and yet how you're trying to prove it to us, right? The quality of sources would be, are these academic and scholarly? Are they written by experts? Are they up to date? And that kind of stuff, right? Or are they by kind of uncertain kind of publishers or authors that really don't have the credentials to talk about these things. Documenting your sources completely is a part of your ethos. An honest presentation of the strengths and the weaknesses in your argument are also part of ethos. Ethos for some people can be part of their reputation. So if you're a professional and you have credentials and experience, then people are more likely to listen and believe you by your say so, right, than they are if you don't have a reputation and they don't know that you have any background. That's why in academic papers, especially for freshman, sophomore, undergraduate level, we don't allow for anything but third person. Because most students don't have any first person ethos that would be relevant or appropriate for an academic paper. Now, there are other kinds of papers that would be totally fine. But remember, in this class, we are writing academic arguments, and so we have that standard that we're trying to go by. So again, the ethos that you bring to the paper by how you're presenting it and the choices that you make. And then again, the ethos that comes from the kind of sources that you're using. If you don't have a personal reputation to kind of help persuade. The last of the three appeals is pathos, and this is most closely tied to the reader. So pathos, think of the words empathy, sympathy, neuropathy, apathy. Those are all about feelings, right? And so pathos is the emotional appeal. And this is how we try to get the reader to do something because of we want them to care about something. We wanted them to feel something, right? I would say that in academia, pathos is the least useful because there's just a leaning towards having credible evidence that's based on logic. We want to see that you're aware of all of the information that's out there and they're using that. Pathos is often used as kind of a shortcut, kind of an ends justifies the means, and because it can be so easily abused and not intentionally. Sometimes people aren't even aware of how they're using emotions maybe inappropriately. A lot of people just say, well, we don't even want that kind of appeal in an academic paper. I want to see a balance because I think a balance is good. And so I mentioned in another video that like in your introduction and conclusion are the best places to use pathos. Because in your introduction, you're trying to get your reader's attention and trying to convince them to read more because they should care, it should matter to them. So part of what you do in the introduction is you make it clear to your audience why it does matter. So things that matter are things that we care about. And in the conclusion, you end with that so what factor, right? So after you give them all of the logos and the ethos, your reader is left, well, okay, so what? Why should I care? Care, feelings. So making an emotional appeal in the conclusion can be what actually triggers someone to do something with the knowledge that you've just given them, right? But it is prone to manipulation. It is prone to propaganda because a lot of times people will, like I said, make a shortcut. So instead of giving us a legitimate argument, they'll just make us feel something. And so that primitive need to protect, to survive, whatever, will oftentimes make people respond and do things that if they actually stopped and thought about it, they might not make those same choices. So sometimes people want to use our emotions against us. And so again, I've kind of told you here in this paragraph about using an introduction and conclusion. And then also about be careful of insidious pathos, where you kind of throw in some adjectives or something to describe someone. For example, the unfair and underhanded tactics of the sheriff. Unless you've actually proven or will prove that the sheriff is underhanded and unfair, then you've actually added emotion there. You're making an emotional value or argument, and you're trying to persuade the reader to not like the sheriff. So you've got to make sure that when you do something like that, that you've actually proven it or that you will prove it with facts beyond just your emotional reaction. So here are some links to other sources if you're really interested in this. And these are links to other places where you can find more about rhetoric. And in another video, we will talk about propaganda and logical fallacies that are the things that can make rhetoric inappropriate or irrelevant or just outright wrong. And that's one of the things you'll be really focusing on for your rhetorical analysis essay, that you will have to apply the rhetorical triangle, but also look out for any kind of fallacies or propaganda.